So my name is Dan Brumbaugh, and I lead the Coastal Training Program at Elkhorn Slough National Estuary and Research Reserve, or NERRS for short. I'm thrilled to be here today to tee up this webinar entitled Using Historical and Elevation-Based Mapping to Understand Our Estuaries. As that title alludes to, we're going to be talking about two general methods that were employed during a recent national in scope research project that focused on all the estuaries of the National Estuary and Research Reserve system. But before we get to that, I am going to say a few words about the NERRS system because I don't think everybody on this call may be familiar with it. It's a system of that's a set of federal-state partnerships around the country. There's 30 of these reserves. The management is usually done by the state partner, with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, providing core funding and guidance for many of the programs. Then NOAA also provides funding to the NERRS Science Collaborative, which offers competitive grants to support research projects and other kinds of projects within the NERRS around the country. So what we're going to be talking about, these two approaches today, we use them as part of a 3-year grant from the NERRS Science Collaborative. So we want to acknowledge them as well as the original NOAA funding. My colleagues who will be talking today, I'd like to just briefly introduce them. We'll start with Andrea Woolfolk, who is the Stewardship Coordinator at Elkhorn Slough National Estuary and Research Reserve, or NERRS, in the Monterey Bay area of California. Andrea also does historical ecology as part of her work. Then we'll be hearing from Suzanne Scholl, who's a GIS specialist at Padilla Bay Reserve up in Washington State. And then Charlie Endress, who works for Moss Landing Marine Labs, also in Monterey Bay, California, which is part of San Jose State University, and who also works for, or is affiliated with Elkhorn Slough, will be talking. As I mentioned, this is a national project and involved many, many contributors, and I'll say a little bit more about that in the formal acknowledgements at the end. But there's too many people to name, unfortunately, individually. But I would like to call out Kirsten Wasson, who's on the call, who was the PI for the project, as well as Laura Brophy from the Institute for Applied Ecology up in Oregon, who was a key advisor and one of the main inspirations behind the research project. So they may feel free to chime in on some of the questions as well when we get to the Q&A. So we sent some background information via email that hopefully directed people to background information and some of the initial results and links to our outreach products. So we're not really going into that much of that during this webinar. We're going to be focusing on our approaches. That said, I'm just going to say a little bit about what the motivation for the project was. So why map estuaries? One is they are among the most impacted major ecosystem types on Earth in terms of loss and degradation. Sometimes so much has been lost or degraded that it's very difficult to recognize what estuaries are or were. For example, this appears to be an agricultural ditch, but was part of the original estuary near Elkhorn Slough. Sometimes the boundaries can be pretty murky, even more natural parts of estuaries. For example, here, a tidal forest the canopy of a tidal forest may obscure the underlying hydrology that sort of indicates that this is part of an estuary. So we have these uncertainties about boundaries and original extents that can plague our full understanding of how estuaries were and are. And so, as I mentioned, estuaries merit conservation action, but if we have those uncertainties, what should we protect and restore? So we believe that a better understanding of our estuaries, both their extent and past habitats, can improve protection by generating better conservation planning, better knowledge for enforcement. And then in the restoration area, we can see what are former disconnected parts of estuaries that could be reconnected in the future. This map on the side here shows the fully tidal part of Elkhorn Slough estuary in blue, and in gray, it's showing all the former parts of the estuary that are behind various kinds of water control structures. So they're in various levels of disconnection and aren't functioning fully in the way they used to as part of the estuary. So those are opportunities perhaps for creating better connectivity and restoration. Maps can also be powerful tools for building public support for conservation, where they can be used to educate stakeholders about estuary dynamics in the past and present, and they can help highlight restoration and adaptation needs and opportunities for the broader community. So that's the why map estuaries. Now I'm just going to give the briefest overview on how. That will set things up for my colleagues. So most estuary mapping uses aerial photos. In this case, this is the habitat map for Elkhorn Slough again that the National Wetlands Inventory has. And you'll be hearing more about the National Wetlands Inventory, or NWI, throughout the course of this webinar. But one of the great things about it is that it provides, consistent mapping across the whole US of wetlands. We decided to take an alternative approach, though, to explore how two separate complementary types of analyses could work: historical mapping, analysis of historical maps, and elevation-based maps. And just to provide the comparison between these two, historical maps tend to have small spatial extents, and which is good because it's very labor intensive to do the analysis, as you're going to hear about. In contrast, elevation-based maps can more easily cover large spatial extents. Historical maps give us rich information about habitat types in the past that we can compare then to our present understanding of habitat types. In contrast, the elevation maps mainly focus on estuary extent and how that's changed. And then, as I mentioned, historical maps obviously give us a picture of the past. The elevation-based maps can give us this picture of both the past and also potential present or estimated present that we may not know about. And so within the domain, the spatial domain of the historical maps, we can look both at how the historical map does for portraying the past compared to the elevation-based maps, and see how they may be congruent or complementary. And then by comparing both of those to the National Wetland Inventory habitat maps, we get a sense of how each methodology, how things have changed between the historical map and the present in terms of habitat types, for example, and their distributions. And then between the elevation-based maps and the National Wetland Inventory, how the extents of the estuaries may have changed. So hopefully that was clear enough. If not, it's going to become clearer as you listen to my colleagues. And I am going to turn it off now to Andrea, who's going to talk to us about historical mapping.
Thank you, Dan. Okay, so Suzanne Shull and I are going to be talking about finding, digitizing, and analyzing habitat data from the historic maps. I'm going to start with an overview of the maps we worked with for our national project, and then we'll jump into methods that you can use at home. So let's go ahead and we're going to start with that overview. So we worked with U.S. Coast and Survey topographic sheets, which are also known as T-sheets. These are maps of the US coastline created between 1834 and 1980. There are several versions of these surveys for any given site, so our team worked with staff from each National Estuary and Research Reserve to pick the earliest T-sheet or similar survey that appeared to be useful for their reserve. Now, I'm going to show you 3 examples. This first one is a detail from an 1852 T-sheet in South Carolina. We'll explore the symbols later, but I hope the big open tidal channels jump out at you here. Now, let's go up the coast to Maine to a T-sheet that was made in 1869. Here you might be able to see the extensive tidal marshes shown with parallel lines just northwest of the open ocean. These T-sheets provide beautiful snapshots of places and habitats from very specific times. Finally, let's head to a very different time and place. This 1926 Hawaii map is sparser in some ways. Some parts of the US were not surveyed until the 1900s, and these later maps can be less detailed, but we found them to be useful and interesting nonetheless. Check out the big fish pond here, the banana groves, and hopefully you can see the mud and sludge that the surveyors said they couldn't cross. But it turns out that most of the surveys that we use for our projects were created in the mid 1800s, and most of those included a lot of intact coastal habitat. So now let's talk about the scale of the T-sheets. So T-sheets can be brought into GIS since most of them are very well surveyed. So this is a screen grab from ArcGIS Pro, and we can see here that individual T-sheets are relatively small. And let me get that one on there. Okay. So this T-sheet is an example from Southern California, and this is the T-sheet we used for the Tijuana River Reserve in San Diego, and this was mapped in the 1850s. Most T-sheets were mapped at a scale of 1 to 20,000 or 1 to 10,000 like this one. And the T-sheet number that I have here is the T-sheet register number, just so, because we'll refer to that again. So although each survey alone is relatively small, taken together, these T-sheets cover most or all of the US coastline. And here's a nice example of that from a great website, Cal Sheets, which was developed by the San Francisco Estuary Institute in collaboration with the Southern California Coastal Water Research Project. This is just San Diego County, but you get the idea of the total coverage of the coastline. For our national project, we use just 1 T-sheet per reserve, but other people should not feel limited to that. There's power in using multiple T-sheets over space and time for a habitat change analysis. All right, so now I'd like to move north to my home estuary, Elkhorn Slough in the Monterey Bay region in California, and show you how we use T-sheets to reconstruct past habitats. So let's go ahead and just focus on a small part of this 1854 T-sheet. The US Coast Surveyors were engineers who carefully mapped the features they saw, and they were using a plane table. The most important feature that they were told to map was the line between the upland and tidal areas. And you see that in almost all the T-sheets, and it's almost always denoted by a thick black line. Other tidal datums varied from region to region. In California, the mean lower low water line was usually mapped using a dotted line. On the East Coast, we often see the mean high water line instead. Other features that were to be mapped in these surveys were waterways, including ponds and lakes, salt marshes and freshwater marshes, beaches and dunes, rocks, shrubs and woodlands, grasslands, agriculture, and man-made things like buildings, dams, ditches, and roads. With all of these pieces in place, we can trace mapped features in GIS, creating geodatabases. Each individual polygon was given a habitat name, but also given a National Wetland Inventory code, since the T-sheet habitats line up well with the NWI codes. In this particular case, you can see I ended up with 11 habitat categories for the Elkhorn Slough T-sheet, including things that I pointed out on the previous slide. So if you're an upland land manager like I am, you'd want to use all of these categories, but our project was focused on tidal areas mostly, so we ignored a lot of the upland stuff for our analyses. And because of that, Suzanne simplified the surveys for us, creating just a few umbrella habitat types, focusing on wetlands. You can see that in her version of the Elkhorn T-sheet, which is on the left, and her simplified legend with just 5 habitat categories, not the 11 that I started with. And then she compared the T-sheet habitats to the current National Wetlands Inventory habitats, which are shown on the right here. Uplands in red were only used in these comparisons to show conversions over time. So here you see a lot of red on the right map where the formal tidal wetlands have been diked and drained, changing them from historic wetlands into uplands today. Okay, So that's a brief overview of what we did for our historical analysis of tidal wetland change across 30 national estuarine research reserves, and we're wrapping that project up. But we'd love to pass our baton to some of you to let you, at your local site, use some of the same historical mapping techniques to examine your coastal habitats, and maybe in more detail than we could do across 30 reserves. So let's move on to the do-it-yourself part of the talk, starting with data acquisition. So for this part of the talk, it's going to be a tour of online and offline archives where you can find these historical data and NWI data. So what I'm going to walk you through is first, how to find the right T-sheets for your area, how to check to see if there are field notes associated with those surveys. Then I'm going to walk you through how to get a high resolution version of your T-sheet. Then we'll talk about how to figure out what the symbols on the T-sheets mean. And finally, we'll move to the present. We'll talk about how to find current habitat data to compare with, which is NWI, of course, in our case. All right, we're going to start with that first point, finding the right T-sheets for your area. But before we jump into that, let me point out that many of my slides are going to include web addresses. And all of the URLs are on the resource list that we sent you as part of the webinar reminder. So don't worry about writing these down. They're all in that document. All right. So NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, is the direct descendant of the U.S. Coast Survey, and they have done an amazing job of making their legacy T-sheets available to everyone. Right now, there are two different ways that I know of to explore T-sheets in any given area, and so those are the 2 bullet points here. This first one appears to be the most updated and the better maintained website, and it is a very nice database that makes downloading files very easy. So I don't want to disparage it in any way, but honestly, I have a soft spot in my heart for the second interface, which uses Google Earth. But before we head to that Google Earth map, let me explain that NOAA has scanned over 14,000 T-sheets, but they've only georeferenced 9,000 of those. Those 9,000 are searchable with the 2 NOAA websites that I'm talking about here. Okay, so if you navigate over to that second website, the Google Earth one, there's some really nice background material on the front page. But if you really just want to cut to the chase, when you get to this page, you would click on the data access here. And when you do that, clicking that will download the KMC file. And if you open that, it should open the Google Earth interface for you. So here we are in Google Earth. Let's zoom into my part of the coast, the Monterey Bay and Elkhorn Slough region. And once you zoom into there, you can see the outlines of the T-sheets for this area. You can see from the legend on the bottom here that the years of the T-sheet are color-coded, with red being the oldest, green being the newest. At Elkhorn Slough, the T-sheets are bimodal. Half are red and old from the mid-1800s, and the other half are green and newer. They're from the 1900s. So for our purposes, we wanted the older maps. So here we're going to click on a red box. And when you do that, up pops a box of things that you can view and download. You can start by just viewing your choice as an image in Google Earth. So let's click that. And here you can see if your chosen T-sheet is worth pursuing. I do like this one, so let's go get some downloads. So we'll go back to that box. And from here, you can choose to download the scan alone, or you can get the scan and its associated world file so you can view the T-sheets in GIS. So here I've downloaded the image file, and it's not bad. If you've got the world file to view in GIS, be aware that's in WGS 84. You might want to convert the coordinate system once you're in GIS. Okay, so now we've identified some good T-sheets for our area of interest, but before we leave this particular website, let's check for surveyor notes. These are the field notes that accompany the surveys. So if your T-sheet comes with a descriptive report, it will give you the option to download it here. I'd guess that maybe 1/4 to 1/3 of the T-sheets have these reports, but if you do have one, it is worth downloading and trying to decipher it. Why do I say that? It can be challenging to read some of the older reports because they were written using handwriting, but they really are worth struggling through. They can have really important explanatory details or cool cultural stories that make the T-sheets more useful or interesting. For the High Tider project, one of my favorite descriptive reports came from the Florida Keys for the Rookery Bay Reserve. This is a little indulgent, but I'm going to read to you a few lines from that mid-1800s report. So here I'm quoting. "The only key inhabited and with anyone within the limits of the survey is Panther Key, occupied by Pilot Gomez, a Spanish who claims to be over 100 years old and is yet an active pilot. There is a well of fair water near his palmetto house. The key is named Panther Key for the number of panthers on it. They've killed all of his livestock. The only legitimate trade carried in this locality is palmetto logs and buttonwood in Key West for building docks and fuel, fishing, and turtling. I saw green turtles in great numbers in the waters behind Pavilion Key. So I'm just trying to convince you that it's worth reading through all of that handwriting. Okay, so let's move on now. So if you're satisfied with what NOAA has georeferenced and posted on its shoreline viewer maps, you can stop there. But sometimes those georeference maps fall short, and sometimes you need something better or something more. In that case, it's a slightly trickier to get your T-sheets, but you can start by going to this site right here. And that site lists all the other 5,000 non-georeferenced T-sheets that were not in the Google Earth interface. For right now, you'll have to look up your area in the indexes, which are formatted as maps and PDFs, and these are up here. So you click on the PDFs and you look for your area. We had to do that for our project in the New York area for the Hudson River because the maps that were on the shoreline viewer were poorly surveyed. So Suzanne found a non-georeferenced T-sheet in the right area, right in here, and that was T-sheet number 800. So then she went back to that big list of all those scanned but not georeferenced T-sheets, and she clicked on T800. And clicking on that let her download this version of the map, which was scanned from what appears to be microfilm, and you can even see like the Scotch tape holding it on there. All right, so we've identified the T-sheets we want to use, and maybe we found a descriptive report. So now it's time to get a better version of our T-sheet. Why? You can use the black and white versions, but there are advantages to getting high resolution color versions. So let's go back to my site, Elkhorn Slough, and here's a detail from the black and white version that I downloaded. It's reasonably clear, but here's the color version. You can see the details are a bit crisper, but more importantly, there's several features in color. The different ink colors represent additions to the map made in later years. So here, the original T-sheet data were drawn in black ink in 1854. The red ink was added in the 1870s, and now we can see that the docks and road didn't exist in 1854. If you're doing a historical analysis, that might be important information. And the coordinates were added in 1927 or later in purple ink. Sometimes there are multiple versions of these tick marks drawn over many decades on a T-sheet, and you cannot tell which coordinates are in which coordinate system without the benefit of seeing the ink colors. That becomes very important when you want to import the T-sheets into GIS. All right, so if you're lucky, you might be able to get your color T-sheet easily. So start here at NOAA's Historical Map and Chart Collection. And once you get to this website, you scroll down, and then you use the search criteria to narrow your search. You could try typing in your T-sheet name or number, but I usually select the T-sheet from their drop-down menu here, and then I select the state that I'm looking at, just to make sure I don't miss anything. And in this case, if you're in California or a few other lucky places, your color T-sheet might be there. And the Elkhorn Slough one that I was showing you just a few slides ago is actually here. And if that's the case, you can simply download the JPEG from this website. But the odds are against it. Most T-sheets have not been scanned in color yet. And so in that case, what you want to do is you want to contact the National Archives. And so I would start at this website. Just to get acquainted with how to order T-sheets. If you want more than 5 color T-sheets, then you either need to visit the National Archives in person, or you need to hire a researcher to go in for you. And we did hire a researcher for the bulk of the T-sheets that we needed for our project, and we paid less than $30 per T-sheet. So if you click on this button, you get a list of approved researchers, and I have a good recommendation if you need it. So feel free to email me for that. That's also on that resource. My email's on that resource list. So in our case, after the researcher finished, we realized we needed a few more T-sheets. And I could not visit the National Archives in person because I live in California, but emails worked great for requesting 5 or fewer T-sheets. So all of this is in the resource list, but let's run through how to request something by email. So first, you write to the National Archives, the cartographic branch at carto@nara.gov. You politely ask for a high-resolution color scan of your T-sheet. Make sure to say that it's in Record Group 23, Records of the Coast and Geodetic Survey. All of the T-sheets are in that record group. Then make sure that you include your T-sheet number, which on your black and white version will be called the register number. And then also include the map name, also on your black and white version, the year that it was surveyed. And if you can read the handwriting, I always think it's nice to include the surveyor's name, but it doesn't seem to be absolutely necessary to include that. So it turns out that that works. The National Archives will email you a very nice scan. And this is just one more example of the difference that it can make. So here's the full T-sheet that the National Archives emailed to me for Winyah Bay in South Carolina. And I just want to show you a random detail from this. So we're going to look at this area of the map. And this is what it looked like from the black and white version that we had. Let's compare it to the color version. So hopefully you can see that habitat details on words that were really almost indecipherable in the first black and white version could be read in the second color version. All right, so now let's make sense of what's on those T-sheets, because the T-sheets themselves don't have legends on them. So we use two main sources to understand the symbols on the T-sheets so that we could map habitats. The T-sheets themselves, as I just mentioned, don't have legends. For the West Coast, we use the T-sheet user guide written by the San Francisco Estuary Institute. SFEI is a pioneer in this kind of mapping, and they advised us on this project. Even if you're from elsewhere, it's worth skimming this handbook because it includes a concise overview of why the U.S. Coast Survey did this work and how. And then it has figures showing how the symbols that SFEI found in the California T-sheets. Some of these symbols apply everywhere, like forest and trees in that second column, and some don't, like the mean lower low water line, like I mentioned before. We just didn't find that much outside of California. Lines for mean higher water are more common in other parts of the US. For other parts of the country, or if you just want to do a deep dive into T-sheets in general, then you're going to want to explore the second source, Shore and Sea Boundaries, particularly Volume 2. This book was written by Alan Shalowitz in 1964, and it covers everything about T-sheets. And you can find this document on NOAA's website, and Chapter 4 is just about the T-sheets. This chapter includes several T-sheet legends covering different time periods and the entire US. Here's just one example of the figures from Shore and Sea, and this is a particular set of symbols that was used on T-sheets in 1865. The symbols did evolve over time. So here you can see a couple of things that didn't make it into that California handbook, things like palmettos and mangroves. Unfortunately, NOAA's online version of this document is fairly low resolution, but you can find the link to our higher resolution version of just these legends in the resource list that we sent you. All right, number 5 on my list. In order to analyze change, we needed a more recent data set of coastal habitats. So at your site, you might have something that's very accurate and recent. And if that's true, I totally recommend that you use that. But for our national project, we needed a recent habitat map that was consistently available across the US, and that led us to the National Wetland Inventory. Our assumption is that most of you are familiar with this product, so we'll go through it pretty quickly. But as a recap, the National Wetland Inventory includes recent maps of wetlands and deep water habitats across the United States, and it's overseen by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. You can view and download your local data from this website, and if you want to do that, you click on Get Data. So from there, you would zoom into your region, and then I like to download the data by watershed. The website offers the watershed data by hydrological units, HUCs, and then if you click on that, you'll receive the data as GIS files. As always, pay attention to the projections when you open these in GIS. If you are new to NWI or rusty on the habitat categories, then you'll want to do a little reading, and this is a great website for that. The 2 documents I used the most during our national project were here. So you go to this page, you scroll down to the important classification documents. Here I used the top 2 documents a lot for our project. So the first one is the Classic Classification Handbook. This is a long document that outlines everything you want to know about how the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service categorizes habitats in its NWI maps. And then the second one on that list is the 2-pager code diagram. And this just shows the habitat categories themselves and the codes that they use. I referred to this constantly. And I'll show you how I applied those codes spatially in just a minute. But before I do that, know that if you're more sophisticated with GIS than I am, then stay tuned. Charlie will explain other ways to use the table during his part of this webinar. So just as an example, this is a portion of NWI for Elkhorn Sloughs, kind of a close-up of what Dan showed us a little earlier. And you can see both some broad wetland categories lumped by color, but there's more detail with those codes, that white text. For example, you can see the deep blue main channel is listed as E1UB, and that corresponds to, I'm bringing up that table here, right? Estuarine, subtidal, unconsolidated bottom. So you get just a bit more information with the code, the color, with the code itself than just the colors alone. The nice thing for change analysis is that NWI's codes can be applied to the T-sheet too. So here's another legend from Shore and Sea Boundaries, and this one is showing symbols used in 1892. So let's see how we can turn those into categories that we can use in GIS, both simple terms and NWI codes. So let's just look at the first column here. And let's start at the top with the salt marsh and what appears to be the mean high water line in the corner right there, with some sand and maybe some mud at an elevation below that line in the upper corner here. In GIS, we might call the area below the mean high water line the tidal flat, and we might call the salt marsh tidal marsh. From there, we can also assign NWI codes, the tidal flat being estuarine, intertidal, and consolidated shore, and that shortens down to E2US, and we might call the salt marsh tidal marsh, and that would be estuarine, intertidal, emergent, and that corresponds to E2EM. So you can go ahead and apply this to almost anything that you see on the T-sheets. It could be salt pans. You can also categorize things that are non-tidal, palustrine, right? Like the freshwater marsh and pond here, oyster beds, maybe some tidal forests, and even lower marsh as well. Okay, and with that, it's time for me to hand the screen over to Suzanne Schull. And Suzanne's going to explain how to bring all of this into GIS, the technical stuff.
So in this section, I am going to take you through the steps of using those historical surveys to create digital map products. And that involves the georeferencing, putting it into a real world coordinate system, vectorization, where we digitize those features into polygon features or line features, and we attribute them with the different habitat types so that ultimately we can do some groupings on those attributes so that we can look at change, see what kinds of comparison there is between the past and what we call the present, what's available in our National Wetlands Inventory. But again, you might think of this from your own perspective of what other data sources you might use. So the field surveys were basically plain tables set on top of a tripod with a theodolite. And using that, they ran baselines to triangulation points to map the features. At those triangulation points, they often established benchmarks, which at that time would be a rock that had chiseled in it a indentation for an angle iron that would support that survey table, so they could go back and resurvey it and thus establish it as a benchmark, which we'll revisit later in this talk. So those surveys were then brought into map using printed reproduction at the scale of the original survey or finer, with reference to these lines of latitude and longitude that are based on something called a horizontal datum. So a horizontal datum is an interpretation of the shape of the Earth. And these datums have improved over the years, given the many surveys that have been done, as thousands and thousands of surveys established more and more triangulation and benchmark points. You can see in the example of this Mississippi map from the 1800s, in black is the original datum, which was created before 1927. And the red is an update done in 1954 using our North American datum 1927 And just as a note, today we're using North American datum 1983. But for this project, many of the maps had already been updated to NAD 27. So that's what we used for our initial georeferencing before we did an ultimate projection to a local coordinate system and a modern horizontal datum. In order to use control points to tie that historic raster image to a georeference map, we would identify the points, the crosshairs of these lines, parallel lines, and identify the lat long decimal degrees. So we take that scan map into like Adobe Illustrator and label the points, and then use those as ID numbers in a text file where we would list the decimal degrees, latitude, decimal degrees, longitude, and then bring that into either ArcMap. In our case, we used ArcMap because it worked so well, and we, or you can use it in Arc Pro. And that is just bringing it in as XY point file. And there you will get a list of points. You can bring your image to adjust to your display extent, and then you can start tying the point you see on the raster image to the point location that's displayed on the screen, knowing the ID number of each. Once these tie points have been created, you can apply the georeferencing. So either in ArcMap or in ArcGIS Pro, you get many options for the type of polynomial correction that you're going to do to it. And so we, based on most other projects of this type, chose to use the first order polynomial. And the reason is that it just shifts, it rotates, and it scales, but it's not going to make a more complex adjustment because it wasn't necessary for these survey maps because of the fact they did such an excellent job of surveying to start with. Here's an example of what some of those other transformations might do to your original raster. So again, we're using that affine transformation, the first order polynomial. So this is an 1840 map of Hudson Bay that Andrea actually referenced earlier, and we worked very hard to reference it. It's such a beautiful map, but in the end, you can see in the blue lines, the estuary extent, it does not align well at all with our final rectification. We then searched for another map, found one from 1860, which just sync up really well with our control points. And so we ultimately used this map. But this brings me to the subject of sources of error. So you can run into trouble when those graticules and projection lines were not drawn properly, or if you get distorted effects from the original map having been stored for as long as it has. There's distortion associated with the scanning process. There's also loss of resolution and distortion due to just the compression. When you scan it, you store it as a TIFF image or JPEG. And the ability of the technician to even identify which of those crosshairs represent the NAD 27 datum reference, or is that even an NAD 27 datum? And finally, the geometric transformation that I just spoke about, the different transformations that you can use can definitely affect your results. So in the case that you don't have the NAD 27 tick marks, we were successful with a couple of those maps to identify the tick mark and then copy the decimal degree latitude and longitude into a file and upload it to this NOAA National Geodetic Survey tool for coordinate transformation. So those pre-NAD 27 tick marks are hopefully, in your case, United States standard datum. And then this program will update that to NAD 27, and then we can use those points. We enter those as our tick points and then do the adjustment. Also, NGS supplies a benchmark resource page. So you remember that Florida map had benchmarks already established on it. This is the area we searched for the name of that one benchmark, which was Casacola. And we can see here, yes, it's still in our benchmark database. Many people who have done any surveying are familiar with these data sheets. They provide you with the coordinate location and the history of the surveying that's been done on that benchmark, its condition, and will give you the reference to a modern datum. Often they've also included a vertical datum, but that's beyond the scope of this project. So we go on to alignment. How well did we do? We didn't do a formal assessment of that positional accuracy, but our end results were quite apparent. They were very good when we aligned them with, in this case, Sapelo Island, Georgia's salt marshes, the big channel areas. You can see on one hand, the channels haven't changed dramatically since the 1800s. And on the other hand, our georeference of the scanned image aligns beautifully. So we are able then to take this georeferenced image into GIS and use a geodatabase to delineate or vectorize all of the features. You can see a unique feature of this site are the tidal channels. So they're very intricate tidal channelization along the bigger channels. So what we used for that were lines as opposed to polygons. We delineated each one of those channels and then buffered them with a 2-meter buffer. We attributed them as either intertidal, no plants, or tidal creeks. And we then copied and pasted that into the delineated polygons of the larger features, the green being the salt marsh, red is upland, blue is subtidal, and deleted any overlapping features. So this process of vectorization resulted in more than 18,000 polygons for our entire national study. So that's 30 different sites. On the West Coast, in particular at Alaska, there were only 19 polygons. It probably took an hour to digitize that site. The Georgia site here that I referenced earlier in the alignment slide had 33,192 polygons. And this one that's displayed here is in Northeast Florida, GTM. It was so big that we split it into 5 pieces and had 5 people digitizing, and it came to approximately 3 weeks, probably more like a month of digitizing just to get all of those small tidal creeks into a GIS database. One of the tools that we used to streamline the process was for attributing, so assigning a habitat type or NWI code to each of those features, and that's called coded domains. So you see here circled in red, those are basically your field, your fields in the attribute table. You go into the field attribution where you can select the domain type, and then over here on the right, we just supplied, I'm not sure it's showing up. Sorry, we got an overprint here of coded domains. So look at the bottom here. You can say intertidal, no plants, grassland, freshwater wetland. You can even have a category for unknown or other if you just don't know what it is at the time of digitizing. And then here at the middle of the slide is where, as you attribute and you go into your attribute table, you just get a drop down selection already symbolized to your standard palette of what your habitat types are. So that saved us a lot of time in definitions, people's using different terms, misspelled words. Here's the final map. This is for Texas at Mission Aransas near Corpus Christi. You can do the same thing with that NWI field. So that's where we used a coded domain for a code for each of those habitats. And here's what it looks like in a coded domain. So the code is the actual habitat. The description is the code itself that corresponds to what it would be in an NWI database. And this is just an example of what NWI would look like given these habitat categories that we used for the historical T-sheets. So then we took those attributes, those many different types of habitats, and we grouped them as to either tidal or non-tidal. And within that, each one is either vegetated or unvegetated. And then we have a category for upland. So we retain the upland only if in the historic map, it had either, it goes from vegetated, from a tidal to an upland category, or it was considered upland and has become some kind of wetland, non-tidal or tidal. This helps simplify the visual. And then you can see this example from Padilla Bay in Washington State. There is extensive tidal marsh in the green in the left-hand image, which has been converted to upland. So all of that area had been diked since the 1800s and is now railroads, highways, and farmland. We also did a union between that historic polygon layer and the current polygon layer and grouped the change between those into these categories so that we could get an idea of where tidal loss and gain had occurred. Also, where those areas of salt marsh had been retained. So here you can see the bright green is where there's been a transition from tidal unvegetated to vegetated, but the lime green is where tidal vegetation had been retained. And the orange is where we've got tidal vegetation that has transitioned to untidal. So in this case, this area channel has been channelized and the dredge spoils from that are deposited here in the north end. So we now have dredge spoil islands surrounded by some new tidal vegetation. So in summary, what we covered here is the process of taking a scanned raster image to a georeferenced map, delineating those features and looking at the change from past to present. In this example, you can see that there's a forested area in this kind of darker green, and then these red lines through it. Those are the baselines where the surveyors actually cut through the trees to get to this triangulation point, which also has become a benchmark and allowed them to map the features in this map. So here we're going to take a little break, and Charlie will then tell you about the elevation-based methods. Thank you.
Elkhorn Slough, that's where I presently am at the Elkhorn Slough NERRS. This first slide here is actually kind of an interesting one. We didn't actually use the products from this, but I want to point it out because I'm going to talk about it later, where everything in green here is what we consider hydrologically disconnected tidal areas. So I'll talk about that a little later on, but it's kind of an interesting view of Elkhorn Slough and where those areas are. So a quick outline here. I'll go over the goal of elevation-based mapping and why we're using elevations. And then I'll go over the different mapping methods we used in GIS. So that would be calculating the extreme water levels, which would be that annual highest tide. We'll be adding the mean high water data sets. These are raster data sets, and combining those with the digital elevation models. And then that'll create this referenced DEM that's referenced to the extreme water levels. And then I'll show you how we made an estuary extent layer. And from that, we were able to extract all these different NWI products. I'll also show you how we compared some of our elevation-based mapping to the historical mapping as well. And then at the end, I'll show you some of the Great Lakes estuary mapping we did, because those methods were slightly different than what we did in the coastlines. And also the NOAA high tide flooding layers turned out to be really useful, and I'll introduce you to those as well. And then lastly, I'll go through some of the problems and troubleshooting we had. So to jump in here, the goal of elevation-based mapping is to essentially reconstruct the past estuary boundaries. And we can do that because we can assume that elevations have relatively remained consistent over time. at least within the error of some of these data sources that we're using. So as an example here, this is early 1900s USGS map showing the areas in blue that are the estuary. If we overlay our elevation-based mapping extent, we can see that they line up quite well, actually. So not only can we use elevation-based mapping to define this historical boundary, but we can obviously use it to define a potential current estuary boundary as well. So even after some of these areas have been diked and levees constructed and railroads put through right up through the marsh, we can still see what that former estuary extent was behind some of these dikes and levees. So it's a way to kind of kill two birds with one stone. You can see what the past estuary extent was as well as the current. Once you have that estuary extent, then we can quantify the estuary status as it remains today. And so this is another example of NWI in our area. So if we were to intersect our estuary extent based on elevation-based mapping with what exists today, we can see that there's not very much emergent tidal marsh that is left in this footprint. And so that really is the crux of what we're trying to get at with elevation-based mapping, is to extend that potential historical tidal extent beyond what Suzanne and Andrea were showing in the T-sheets. Another example would be up in Padilla Bay, where we can see in blue here, this would be our elevation-based estuary extent that is no longer considered tidal. And you can see that it's completely covered by farms, just to zoom in on that. And this is also an area that Suzanne was showing in Padilla Bay, in the southern part of the bay. So it's another example of how we can extend all of that historical mapping to a much broader and larger area. So now I'm going to go over just a quick overview of what I'm going to present for each of these numbers here. And I first want to point out that these methods were first pioneered by Laura Brophy and the GIS team at the Pacific States Marine Fisheries Commission, and the paper that they put out in 2019 that documented all the estuary loss on the West Coast. And they used very similar methods to what I'm going to present today. We modified them slightly. The NOAA data was instrumental in this project. We used a lot of NOAA data for the elevation-based mapping. From the extreme water level data, we could use that, combine those with the NOAA mean high water rasters. I'll show you a bit more about that. And then we combine these two with the digital elevation models. These also came from NOAA. And these were for the sea level rise viewer. A lot of these data sets came out of that project itself. And just an example of what one of those DEMs looks like, if you download it from the NOAA site, it would be like this for the Elkhorn area. So we can combine these together. We clipped it to these Huck watersheds, which we called our area of interest. And then we would get something like this that was a new DEM that was now referenced to our maximum high tide, our extreme water levels. And I'll go into more of this in a minute. And then from that, we could create this vector file data set, this estuary extent layer. And from that, we can extract the NWI data to see what the different data sources are. If they were green, that would mean they were overlapping, the NWI and the estuary extent. If they were blue, it was areas that were identified in the estuary extent elevation-based mapping, but not by NWI. So these could be considered areas of loss. We could also group these habitats. We'll get into that. And then lastly, we would compare the estuary extent with what was generated by the T-sheet mapping team, Suzanne and Andrea, and a comparison of that and see how that turns out. So I'm just going to go into how these techniques were performed in GIS. Let me first start with the classic sort of vertical tide datums that you'd see from a NOAA tide station. This lists the mean high or high water and the different tidal datums here. What we're after is everything above that mean high or high water, which a lot of the stations don't list. Many do, however. So we're looking for this area up here, what we're calling our extreme water levels, reference to mean high or high water, because those are the areas that are going to flood our marshes the highest. These points along the coast here are all showing, they're all showing a portion of the 112 water level stations that are stations along the coast. Each of these are reporting an exceedance level. Right now we're seeing numbers reporting the 50% exceedance level. What that means is that, let's say, take this one up here in Portland, Maine, 2.47 feet above mean high water would be the probability that that elevation would flood in a 100-year time span. So it's a 50% probability. So 50 years out of 100, same as 1 year out of 2. We found this exceedance level, this 50% exceedance level, to match really well with what we saw as our maximum estuary extent. And this was verified by Laura Brophy and her team in that West Coast study, where they did quite a bit of ground truthing to determine that 50% exceedance level. And I just want to point out that we're also referring to that as the annual highest tide, which is a little different if you think about it, because once every 2 years is not the annual highest tide. But what her team found is that it aligns really well with the annual high tide line, and that may be due to the vegetation interference that you're getting with LIDAR. And so that vegetation interference can oftentimes cause an upward bias in the DEMs. So that this 50% exceedance level, even though it seems a little bit high, it actually performed quite well in identifying that maximum extreme tide level for the year. So this is the NOAA data, reference to mean high water. We also used another data set referred to as the NACS data set, or the North Atlantic Coast Comprehensive Study. This is a high density of modeled point data, over 16,000 points that represent storm surge, wave heights, and extreme water levels. Now these, because of that high density, we decided to use those because we found that they matched quite well with what was being shown by the NOAA 50% exceedance levels. So in the NACS data set, these are referred to as annual recurrence intervals, ARIs, and the 2-year annual recurrence interval match quite well with the 50% exceedance level in the NOAA. So for all of the areas that we mapped around the country, with the exception of these from the Chesapeake Bay to Maine, we used NOAA. Chesapeake Bay to Maine, we used this NACS data set. So I'm going to point out the differences between those and how we used both of them together. So going back to those NOAA points, you can see down here in the southeast, there's only a handful of points. There's about 8 points separated by hundreds of miles. So they're few and far between. We found that a spline with barriers interpolation in GIS seemed to work well because we can confine that interpolation using the barrier itself. And in this case, we didn't have to create a really defined, sharply defined barrier because we had so few points in that area. And they didn't range a lot in elevation. These are now, what I'm showing here is meters above mean high water, each of these. So there's not a lot of variation here. And you can see it from on the right panel, you can see how that interpolation worked out in meters above mean high water. So those are the NOAA points. Getting back to the NACS points up in the Northeast, notice that these are annual recurrence interval of 2 years. These are, again, reference to NAVD 88. That means each one of these elevations is above that NAVD 88 vertical datum. You can see there's quite a bit of variation that runs along the coast from the Chesapeake Bay up to Maine, up almost as much as 3 to 3.5 meters, which is a lot. What we really liked about this data set is just how detailed it was. It went way up into these upper estuaries where we were expecting these extreme water levels to go. So we ended up using this data set, but we realized that because of that high density of data points, we had to be really careful with how we did our interpolation. What can happen when you're doing an interpolation, if you're not defining your barrier very well, you can have what's called this kind of overland spill effect, where some points can influence points in another watershed. So I'll show you how we got around that. By using all these HUC 10 watersheds, we could overlay those with our 3-foot sea level rise layer. This also came from NOAA. and actually intersect those to get all of these different watersheds in this area. So I'm going to zoom in here to the Chesapeake Bay. So these are all the different watersheds. I think it was the Huck 10 watersheds in this area. If we clip these out, basically you just run erase or the erase tool using that 3-foot layer. Now we have a barrier data set that allows the interpolation to run up into each one of these little estuaries. But it's preventing a spillover effect. That's what these lines are doing. So if I just lay the points on here, a point that's in this area cannot influence a point over here because of that barrier. So this took quite a bit of time working this out because we wanted to make sure that these points were not having that sort of spillover effect. But editing a polygon data set like this took quite a lot of time. So this was a spline with barriers again at a 100-meter resolution. And again, this data set is referenced to NAVD88. And there it is along the entire northeast coast. So just to recap here, what we just did with the NACS data set, we defined an extreme water level reference to NAVD88. Those are for all the points from the Chesapeake Bay to Maine. And it included that, what we call the 50% exceedance level, or up to that annual recurrence interval of 2 years. For the NOAA data, we were only defining this portion of the datum, which is above mean high water. So because we need to bring everything back to a common datum, common vertical datum, which is NAVD88, we had to calculate this area as well, which is the mean high water. And fortunately, NOAA had already done that for us. They had already run the exercise with all the tide stations through VDatum, which is an excellent resource if anybody is not familiar with it, where you can convert tide datums. And so they went ahead, they created these what they called the NOAA-derived mean high water surface relative to NAVD88. And that's what the colors are showing. It's that mean high water reference to NAVD88. And this is covered for all of the coasts in the US, with the exception of Alaska and Hawaii. So this, we simply took this raster data set and we added that to what we created here, our 50% exceedance raster that we just interpolated. And that way we get everything down to our common vertical datum of NAVD88. That's now we've calculated our full extreme water level for that range, for all of these different sites. So once we have that, and then we can take our water level data and combine that with actual land elevations. And so that's what we're going to do here. We take DEMs. These are all coming from NOAA, sea level rise data viewer. Sometimes these DEMs, they're split into chunks along the coast, and sometimes the boundaries of those chunks happen to overlay exactly where we need to do our analysis. And so in cases like this, we would have to mosaic 2 of these data sets together. They're really large, so it could take hours to do that operation. And then in this example of Ace Basin, we would end up clipping out that area of interest around there. So just to lower the processing time for each of these sites. Plus, we're really only focused on the NERRS and the estuaries surrounding them. So we wanted to keep our processing time down. So those get clipped there, and we end up with something like this. Now I'm back over in Elkhorn, but we end up with a raster data set. And we take this DEM now, and we're going to subtract our extreme water level. And once we do that, this is the actual DEM we get. And we're subtracting that so that we can now create a new vertical datum. This new vertical datum becomes our extreme water level datum. And the reason we do that is because everything now 0 and below, everything negative, is all of those elevations that go up to that extreme water level. So it's a very simple way to create what we call our estuary extent, where you're just defining 0 and below is now areas that are getting inundated by those maximum extreme tides. And just an example of that in Elkhorn, if you look at this closely in this area, you can see all these areas of the marsh are defined really well by all of these green colors, green to blue colors here. So anything that's going to be yellow and above would be what we'd consider upland or not within our estuary extent. Now, the first slide I showed you earlier that showed those hydrologically disconnected areas, NOAA has a really great sheet, a PDF that walks you through all the steps of creating that. I took that PDF and basically turned that into a model. And I'm going to show you several examples of these models. I don't expect you to read every single one of these tools because there's a lot in here, but I just want to show you kind of the work that goes into creating these models. In this case, with using ArcGIS Pro Model Builder, we could use that NOAA, those NOAA steps to create that hydrologically connected depth grid. What that slide that I showed you in the beginning. It turned out we didn't use this for the final products in our project, but it was a useful tool in order to create that kind of raster, that final raster layer. Once we had that final raster, we can then convert that to a polygon. And so I again run these through Model Builder. We used Model Builder a lot because we had so many different data sets that we had to run, 30 different data sets we had to run through. So it made it a heck of a lot easier. I know some of you are probably more familiar with Python than Model Builder. I'm old school. I kind of work in Model Builder and I like it. So we ran these through to create an actual vector file, a smoothed vector file. And this is what we refer to as our estuary extent. So from this now that we have a polygon layer that represents our estuary extent, we can then combine it with our NWI tidal area. So everything in green here would be NWI, tidal, all of those tidal polygons. Everything in blue would be freshwater. We combine these together in a union, we get this result, which is our tidal extent by data source is what we're referring to it as. So basically everything in dark green would be where our elevation-based mapping estuary extent and our NWI tidal are matching, where they're overlaying. Everything in blue would be only areas where our estuary extent layer exists and not any of the NWI tidal. So it's a really nice way to see where areas that have been potentially lost to land use change. So again, those are the colors that are showing there. And this operation here that I'm showing on this slide is also, I'm going to show here in the model. So one thing to keep in mind is that in order to run these processes using NWI all across the nation, we needed a nationwide layer of NWI to do this, to make it a lot more efficient instead of going into every single site and downloading those NWI files. We had a 16 gigabyte nationwide layer from NWI that they sent us. And then we could clip that out for each operation that we ran for each site. What I also did, which was slightly different than what Suzanne and Andrea did, is I used NWI provides a CSV layer, which are the code definitions. And it's a really great way that you can join to your NWI layer in ArcGIS by the attribute, so that you don't have to remember or look up the chart for all these different codes. You get them all listed out in the columns. And so this was really a great thing for me to have because I use these in the model. The other portion of this model would be that union of those two data sets together. And then we would calculate the new fields and then run summary statistics on all of those. So another product we're taking that estuary extent layer, and then we're also unioning it with the full NWI, all of the different classes, the tidal, the freshwater, the modifiers, everything, so that we can see all of the NWI classes that are falling within this estuary extent. The reason we do that, and we also group them, and the reason we do that, similar to what Andrea and Suzanne were doing, is because there's only, I think, over 5,000 different codes in NWI. So we needed a more manageable layer or symbology layer to have, so that we didn't have so many different types of habitats. So we created these 7 different habitat codes from NWI that we used to compare with other sites. And once again, showing the model for that process. This model came from Brett Holycross at Pacific States Marine Fisheries Commission. He was really helpful in helping us adapt this for our needs. So I'll just walk you through this. Again, you don't have to see all these things, but We're intersecting that estuary extent in NWI. We're adding fields. We're selecting and defining the estuarine, vegetated, and tidal habitats. And then in the Laura Brophy's study that they helped on, they were defining areas as lost, retained, and not applicable. And we had a little bit of issues with NWI in some parts of the country where we didn't want to define things as lost because we knew that those areas were still there. So that's why we ended up, instead of using these categories, we changed them to those grouped 7 classes. Another part of Brett's model I'm not going to get into is he defined areas, polygons, by shape, size, and compactness in order to assess what they called this bathtub ring. And that's just simply a way of determining which areas are close enough between 2 union layers, and then defining them likewise. I'm not going to get into that. As you can see, the model is really dense there. So it's a pretty complex algorithm that he went through to do that. And we used it in ours, but I'm not going to get into it for this. If anybody has questions on that, I'd be happy to answer those though. So we ended up with our estuary extent layer. The last thing we could do with that is overlay that or union that with our historical habitats that were created by Andrea and Suzanne to see what sort of differences we were getting between the elevation-based extent and the T-sheet mapping. And that's what we're showing here. So everything in yellow would be areas where the T-sheet estuary, only the T-sheet was showing as estuarine and not the elevation-based mapping. Blue would be where areas that our elevation-based mapping would be showing as estuarine, but not the T-sheet. And then green would be areas where they overlap together. So I just want to show you kind of a zoomed in example here. This is the Moss Landing power plant. This is an old refractory. They were actually extracting magnesium from seawater for decades here in this spot. It's a huge white blob that used to be part of the estuary. But from the elevation-based mapping, it doesn't show up as that because the elevations, obviously, from LiDAR were created well after this refractory was created. But if we look at it in the T-sheet, we can clearly see that this was there's tidal marsh here, possibly a salt pan. So this is a great example of how the T-sheet is identifying an area of estuary, of past estuary, that the elevation-based modeling simply cannot. So once again, using these in tandem, elevation-based mapping with T-sheet mapping is an excellent way to go. They really complement each other well. So I'm going to move on now to the Great Lakes water levels. Was a slightly different process that we used. We didn't have the density of water station or water level stations in the lakes. I think there was one here in Duluth. And we also just didn't have all of those different NOAA layers, those the mean high water rasters and all that. So we had to come up with some slightly different methods, which turned out to be a bit simpler for defining the estuary extent, which was just simply using a LiDAR data set that we got from, I think, the state there, and then defining an actual contour, and then seeing how well it worked. And so we worked quite a bit with the POCs, the points of contact, and the regional experts to define what their maximum estuary lake, water level would be there. We started out, we were sort of like just throwing darts at a board here. We started out with a 1.8 meter contour above average lake level. But after analyzing these closely, looking at some aerial imagery, it looked like that was a little high. So we went back to the drawing board and we actually went to the lake level viewer and also downloaded information from the Duluth water level station. And we ran those through some calculations to calculate the monthly max mean of the lake levels. So we came up with these numbers here, and then presented those to the POC at Lake Superior, and we all came to a consensus that those seemed to work much better. So that's what we ended up doing with Lake Superior, and here it is shown as that monthly max mean was that 183.65, and then if we wanted to include that area just above that kind of max, and we can see those in the light blue as well. So there were a lot more methods that Suzanne and I worked for a long time on this, on the next phase of it, which was defining all of the different NWI polygons. And that was a long process because it was just so different than any of the other coasts that or any of the other data sites that we worked on. So I'm also going to touch on the high tide, the NOAA high tide flooding layers. These were layers that we kind of stumbled on fairly early in the project after we had started doing all of our DEM, elevation-based modeling. And we found them to be extremely useful in checking our results, essentially. So these HTF layers, they're nationwide coverage, which is great because ours is not. And they define these coastal flood thresholds. So you've got the minor, moderate, and major flood levels in these coastal zones. And those are equivalent to about 0.5 meters, 0.8, and 1.17 meters above mean higher high water. There's, again, we have a reference for this in our references sheet. If you want to check out more information on these layers or download them, they're really useful for seeing these kind of minor, moderate, and major floods. So I'm going to show you an example of a minor flood. This is in Wacoit Bay in Cape Cod. And then if we go to a moderate flood, it'd be these orange areas just above that minor. And then a major flood would be these areas in red. And then what's cool is that like I said, we could use these as a check on the elevation-based mapping products that we were producing. So I'm going to go back and forth between the high tider that we produced and what they're producing from their flood layers. And ours, you can see, lines up really nicely with their moderate flooding. It would be that orange one. And we found this to be generally true across on all of the coasts, that our elevation-based mapping lined up somewhere between the minor and moderate flooding layers from NOAA. So you could skip all of those steps that I went through and just go right to these high tide flood layers, and you'd get pretty good results if you want to try to do the same things. So those are a great resource. One thing we could not tackle in this study, unfortunately, was ground truthing. It was just, we didn't have the bandwidth for that for all of the different reserves. But it is extremely important, as Laura Brophy found, and they used it in their study. It's necessary for checking that upslope boundary of the tidal extent to see how well that's matching with those highest reach of tides. And you can use survey gear, RTK or whatever, to go out and measure those, as well as vegetation monitoring. So can't speak highly enough about doing ground truthing. I wish we could have if we had more time for this project. Instead, we really relied on the visual analysis of the maps that we were creating, and we passed those off to the local experts and the POCs to see how well our estuary extent was lining with what they had created, or what they were observing on the ground. So lastly, I'm just going to go a little bit into the problems in troubleshooting we had. Obviously we're not getting into the weeds on the error that can be associated with all these different data sets. That would probably be a whole nother webinar in itself that we don't have time for. But you can imagine just, V-datum interpolations, you're going to be introducing error, especially when you have tide stations that are separated by hundreds and hundreds of miles. Same thing with our 50% exceedance elevations and the interpolations we're doing on those. I think LiDAR DEMs, most of them, just a single LiDAR pulse has an error in the range of, 8 to 15 centimeters or something like that. So, all of these you have to take into account. Vertical land motion. New York Times just had an excellent story this morning about the East Coast water levels that are, or the East Coast elevations that are dropping from groundwater overdraft. So that's a big factor that's going to play into an error exercise. And then sea level rise as well. That's something that is just going to change the calculus on all of these different these maps that we're producing. NWI mapping, we had quite a bit of trouble with in the Gulf and in the Southeast. There were some really old NWI maps down there, so we couldn't necessarily trust those as well. My understanding is that I think they're looking to improve those with more elevation-based mapping, which is great. But obviously there's sources of error anytime you're doing aerial imagery mapping, such as NWI. And then land use changes, you know, they're going to change things. If any land use changes were done prior to those LiDAR DEMs being collected, such as filler excavation, then you're not going to be able to see that, what those former estuary extents were before those were done. We had some really large data sets, such as ACE. Those took many hours to process, and sometimes it would throw an error in our models, which then we'd have to run it all over again. Obviously, anytime you're working with huge data sets, I'm sure many of you know, it can be time consuming and you have to display a lot of patience. We worked in local projections for distance and area accuracy. Plus, we wanted to provide all of this data to the POCs, regional experts, after our project was done. So we always were trying to work in the local NAD 83 UTM coordinates. Anybody that does a lot of geoprocessing, like we were doing for this study, remember this tool, Repair Geometry. I think I threw it into every single tool set I was using, sometimes 2 or 3 times, just because the geometry can get screwed up when you're doing a lot of these big time geoprocessing steps. And obviously we had to be careful with our data management and our tool for the tool outputs, making sure those were cataloged properly. And then lastly, what we did at the very end, we wanted to take all of these data sets that we were producing at these individual sites around the country and then combine them into one nationwide data set in the cloud, in ArcGIS Online. And that was really challenging. I mean, there are hundreds of thousands of of polygons and possibly millions of vertices for each one of these data sets. So getting those into the cloud, into AGOL, was really time consuming and difficult. And thankfully, the folks at Pacific States Marine Fisheries Commission, particularly Van Hare, were excellent in helping us to do that with their enterprise license. Dan didn't want me to end on a sour note, so I'm going to let you know that we are working on a custom-based, elevation-based mapping tool that I'm going to provide to you. So you can run some of these similar analyses on your own with one single standalone tool. I'm going to be providing that as an ArcGIS Pro package with a tool built in. And what that does is essentially it's going to be taking a DEM. It could be a local LiDAR DEM, and then combining that with a local estuary habitat layer. And then it's going to spit out your tidal extent by data source. And what you get from that is essentially like this blue area. It could show where elevation-based mapping has identified areas in your estuary that could have been likely tidal in the past, but are no longer today. So that could be a really useful tool for some of you folks that want to do this on your own up there. We'll try to have that up in the next week or so if everything goes well, but we'll see. And we'll put that in the references page as well. I think that was my last slide, so I'll stop there.
Well, thank you. First of all, thanks, Andrea, Suzanne, and Charlie for explaining those methods. That was a lot, and we appreciate it. As I mentioned at the beginning, there was a lot of people involved in this project, and I think it's worth re-mentioning, not all of them by name, but at least, the greater, I guess, universe of people who contributed. We had a steering group, which included the 3 people who spoke today, Charlie, Suzanne, and Andrea, and Kirstine, of course, Laura Brophy, a group of representatives from key NERRS, from key reserves, as well as myself. And we collectively, covered a lot of ground in support of the technical co-leads, as well as the product subcontractors. We had a bunch of other, at the top here, a bunch of other technical mapping advisors, which were instrumental, as various speakers mentioned in different parts of the talk today. So we appreciate their contributions. all the NERRS then, we had points of contact who kind of reviewed the materials that we came up with, provided additional insights, provided some ground truthing, when they were able to. And then we had an advisory committee that helped inform our outreach products, and then amazing product contractors who actually built those products. So I just wanted to, again, extend my appreciation and acknowledgement to all those people. We've mentioned in various places, that all the products are available on this website of the National Estuary and Research Reserve Association. So this essentially serves as a clearinghouse. There's a recording of the earlier webinar about the project results on from November 30th. This link from February 14th will be a recording of today's webinar. And then there's all these other materials, that are available for those who are interested in diving deeper. So that's it. We're going to go to more general Q&A now. Please use the Q&A function to enter your questions. If you need to clarify something or follow up, feel free to come off mute and ask your question. And then we're going to be placing a link in the chat for the evaluation survey that we'd love your input on. So please reply to that either today before you close your Zoom window and lose that link. And if you do, we'll be sending it via email and hounding you indefinitely until you reply. So that's it. I'm going to stop sharing. And why don't the presenters, come on video, and we can tackle questions as they come in. I think there's several that are open there that are fair game for people.
And Suzanne, if you didn't like any of my answers to the ones that I typed the answer, please please weigh in or correct anything I got wrong.
It's all accurate. I added some comments to them already, so.
Great.
I'm seeing some questions, I think, on elevation-based mapping. So the first one from Francis, I'm curious if the HAT, so that would be the highest atmospheric tide, I think, HAT level was considered over mean high water, and if so, if it was found not to perform well for your needs. Again, we took the methodology directly from the Laura Brophy study, which did a lot of work identifying which tide levels appeared to match best for their study. I'd like to invite Laura, she happens to be on the call, which is great, to say some more about that if you'd like to, Laura.
Sure, thank you. Can you hear me? Cool. So
yes.
Highest astronomical tide, the HAT, would be a useful datum where you only have the influence of the astronomical tides, but we often have riverine additions to those tidal heights that make HAT not a very useful datum. So instead, we really have to look at the combination of river flow effects and tides that generate the overall tidal regime. And so that's why going to some of NOAA's extreme water level studies and analyses was super useful for us. And that 50% exceedance does work better than using highest astronomical tide. Really good question.
So Laura, stay on, because I'm going to read the next one, if you'd like to. What does this mean in terms of climate change? The combined sea level rise, increased storm tide, and increased rainfall intensity. Has there been research and mapping on how the maximum estuary extent will be impacted? What exceedance level would be used for that? 0.5% or 0.2% for 2100? Is a 50% exceedance level useful for current conditions? Based on historic, more recent, given climate change is already impacting storms, tides, sea level rise, rainfall?
Yeah, really good question again. Yeah, we have found 50% exceedance has been matching up pretty well with current conditions. And so that's the result of the local points of contact sort of vetting these layers and saying that, yes, they do feel that these represent areas that are currently within tide range or would be if they didn't have barriers. In terms of climate change, there are some in-depth studies on how that could alter flood elevations, but our analysis didn't attempt to get at that. So I think that's a whole separate ballgame and an important one.
Next question, are the high tide flooding layers based on climate change? If so, what time horizons? Is it the bathtub model or more accurate? Does it include increases in rainfall intensity? I would encourage you to go to our resources page and download the report for those HFT layers. It's quite long, but that would have, I don't know offhand, I don't know if you do, Laura, about the bathtub model and if it includes that or includes rainfall intensity. We'd have to double check that.
I think it does. At least it matches up fairly well with our layer, which is again based on this overall exceedance, not just astronomical tides. So rainfall probably does play a role. However, I have to say NOAA's extreme water level stations are almost all on the outer coast. And so as you move up estuary, that extrapolation that we did may not necessarily represent the highest possible tides upriver. So we're a little conservative probably in some cases. Let's see, I think that was only part of the question, but I've forgotten what the other part was.
I think you got most of it.
Okay.
HTF,
the high tide flood layers don't represent climate change. They are current conditions, and you can read in the report about how that might, I think, how it might change with climate change.
Good. Next one, I think I could tackle. How is the elevation model construction process different for Alaska and Hawaii, considering available data resources? So that's a good question. I didn't get into that in the talk. Alaska was definitely a challenge. They had some older LiDAR we could use for half of the bay up there where the NERRS is. And so that was for the northern half of the bay. I remember for the southern half of the bay, I think it's Steve Baird and his team had mapped using aerial imagery, because there was no good high resolution digital elevation models for that area. I think 10 meters was the minimum. Instead, what they did is back in, I think it was in early 2000s, they mapped the high tide line based on RAC. And they did that by, I think, using aerial imagery, I'm pretty sure. And that was the best we could do for that southern portion of the bay. And they felt pretty confident about that layer that we used in that southern portion. And then we combined that with the DEM that was on the northern part of the bay. So that one was a kind of a mixed bag of methods that we had to do for Alaska. And in Hawaii, we had the DEMs for Hawaii. I don't believe we had the mean high water level, but we did have the highest tide level, and that was referenced to a mean high water. And then I think what we just did is again, we kind of like what we did for the Lake Superior, is we used a LiDAR data set and we defined a particular contour within that bay. I don't remember doing any interpolations there because it was just one single tide station that we were able to use. Did you notice any significant differences in accuracy between elevation-based estuary extent mapping versus elevation plus T-sheet mapping of the estuary extent? So this is getting into sort of the results. I don't know if Andrea or Kirstine, if you recall, if we summarized all of our differences between our elevation-based mapping and T-sheet mapping. I can't remember it off the top of my head from all the results that we produced, but I did show you an example of where we could see very obvious differences. That was that slide at the end there that showed the green the light green, the yellow, and the blue. You know, I don't know if any of you have any memory of results on those.
Yeah, I didn't try to pull everything all together at any point. So if Kirsten's here and did that, I'd love to hear that. But right, I think we saw it as Charlie's pointing out. I mean, we were able to see things like it, right, where there had been fill, or if the, you know, the T-sheet people had missed something, we could see that. But in terms of like, was one more accurate, like one had 20-meter accuracy and one had like 20 centimeters. I don't think we got at that. Suzanne, would you have a different answer than that? No. Okay.
I would encourage people who have those sorts of general questions to watch the other webinar, because we kind of get at it qualitatively, and then stay tuned because the sort of synthetic results are in preparation now to be published. And so that will be coming out, and maybe that will get at some of those sort of broader questions.
Yeah, and Kirstine chimed in, we do have a summary table in our manuscript in preparation that examine those differences between elevation and T-sheet mapping. Okay, this is another one for me. Curious, what is the main geometry that has been disconnected or partially corrupted that the repair geometry fixed? That's a great question that I don't have an answer for, because I didn't want to dive into that. All I knew is that when I put that tool in there, that repair geometry, it was fixing whatever, say, null values. I can't remember what the code, those errors would throw, but oftentimes you'd get a field or one particular feature that had a null geometry, or vice versa, or something like that. So I don't know. I'd have to dig back into those to figure out exactly what was happening there. But it's a good question. And then last, did you come up with general trends in how the estuary may have changed with impact from types of urbanization? We didn't define in our synthesis, we're not really defining different habitats down to that level, you know, if it was developed or not. So I don't think that's going to come out in our final synthesis. We started the project with that in mind, that we could do it, but generally we would have had to incorporate other data layers beyond NWI, because NWI is really just defining wetlands. And so in order to quantify how much urbanization that has taken place or taken over estuaries, we really would have needed other data layers, and we didn't incorporate those into our study.
Something for somebody else to take on.
The unique thing about this project is we did have all these point of contacts at each one of the 30 reserves. There were incredible resources for ground truthing. And I would highly recommend that you visit the webpage and go in and explore the digital products that we have. Okay, so this is our website here, where you can get at that some of the general results in that first page. And then this was a whole list of resources on the right-hand side. It includes the story map, which will take you through everything we covered, and then gets you into the products that we developed. And those include reserve report. So one reserve report in thorough detail for every reserve, and then also a brief overview. And then there's this new resource that is our Changing Estuaries web app. And you can jump in with a navigation or go straight into it. But that will give you a direct link to our project summary, as well as the reserve report for each one of the 30 sites. And then if you zoom in to one particular site, I'm sorry to make you seasick, and check out the data layers, then you can immediately start going in to adding all the different layers that we've created. So they're all posted to ArcGIS Online, and you can explore this data yourself. You can add swipe tools, change base maps. So I highly recommend you explore that.
All the contact, basically emails for people who presented today, are located there. So if you have any follow-up questions for anybody, that's a way to reach people.